Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So, today we are going to pick up our discussion on human impacts on the environment by sort of refreshing ourselves on this idea of biodiversity. So, when we talk about biodiversity, if we break that word apart, meaning life and diversity, just this variety of life that we can have, we're talking about how many different types of species, many different types of organisms can exist in a given area. When we look at globally some of the biggest biodiverse hotspots, we're talking about things that often are right around the equator. So things like your tropical rainforests, coral reefs in our aquatic oceans, those sorts of things. And there's a lot of species richness in those environments. And that's a really big deal because remember that biodiversity is a really good indicator for the stability of a given ecosystem. We start losing that biodiversity and it has some really long-term effects on that ecosystem. Um, an ecosystem that is very biodiverse is capable of withstanding and adjusting and adapting as an ecosystem to different species leaving, whether it be they're emigrating from the area or they go extinct or they just get decreased in number because of a hurricane or something like that. That there's enough species, enough for different types of species that can fill voids in the food chain, for example, or be able to sort of absorb a niche that has now been left open by a species that has disappeared. The less types of organisms in the environment, the less likely that those holes can get sort of plugged up and be able to continually be a functional ecosystem. That being said, that loss of biodiversity goes above and beyond even just the local stability of the ecosystem. Um, we can talk about just the extinction sort of domino effect, right? If I pull one species out of a not so biodiverse ecosystem, that has implications of the food chain, which can cause even more species to go extinct. And from a human standpoint, we're talking about just, in some cases, just loss of natural beauty, right? We go to this idea of ecotourism, and this has become a really big deal to go see different organisms in their natural habitats. So, going to visit tropical rainforests, snorkeling on coral reefs, um, going up to the polar regions to see polar bears or whale watching off the coast of New England, right? All of this is some big economic draw for those areas that have these types of environments that people want to go explore. We start losing that biodiversity and that stability of those ecosystems, that tourism and that money goes away. We can also talk about just loss of medical and technological advances. There are a lot of things in medicine compounds that we use to treat illness that have at least naturally originally come from living things. There is a lot of medicine that we have discovered in plants and compounds that bacteria or fungi might produce. If we start losing biodiversity, we may not even know that those organisms exist, let alone the compounds that they make exist that could be really useful and beneficial to us as humans for disease prevention or disease treatment. And although we may start making those compounds in a lab so they are synthetic and we can make them at much higher levels and not be dependent on the organisms who produce them to make them at the levels we might need or want. And then we can tweak their chemistry a little bit here and there too. If we don't know that the compounds exist in the first place because we don't know the organism exists in the first place, then it really doesn't seem to matter. We can't kind of make things up out of thin air. Same thing with technological advances, especially when we talk about things like genetic engineering. We're going to talk about restriction enzymes and the fact that these come from bacteria naturally, and we now use them as a way to make a lot of human proteins to treat things like diabetes. But if we didn't know the bacteria existed because we wiped them out or they got wiped out as a result of things that we are doing or just sort of natural um, environmental change, then we don't get to have those advances because we don't know that the things even exist. So biodiversity is a really big deal, and we've got to be able to understand that biodiversity occurs on multiple levels in order to truly be able to protect ecosystems and their biodiversity. So when we talk about biodiversity, oftentimes we end up talking about species diversity, sort of here in the middle. So having that variety of species in an ecosystem or throughout the biosphere, just again, sort of have choices, if you will. I don't know if that's the best term, but as a predator, you've got multiple prey to feed on. One of your prey disappears, you're probably not going to die, right? So that idea of a generalist versus a specialist is a big deal there. We can also talk about ecosystem diversity and just the need for the variety of ecosystems throughout our biosphere. We've got lots and lots of different organisms that exist and have taken hundreds of thousands of years to adapt to the ecosystems that they live in. If we continue with things like climate change, we are smushing together ecosystems. Some of them are disappearing, some of them are shrinking, some of them are growing, and all of that's going to have impacts on the species diversity. Drive that all the way down to genetic diversity. We need that genetic diversity both between different populations of the same species as well as within the population. And that goes back to the idea of natural selection. So the bigger the population size, the bigger the genetic diversity, the more likely that as environments do shift and change, so long as they happen to change slow enough, there should hopefully be enough genetic diversity within that population and between those populations to be able to adapt and change as natural selection wipes out individuals who are less fit for that new changing environment. If we get to population sizes that are so small, particularly problematic in species who are threatened or on that endangered species list, their population size is just so small, and as a result, their genetic diversity is so small that we get to a point where you sort of get into what they call this extinction vortex, where you just get to such a small level that really nothing we do is going to bring them back because the diversity isn't there in their genes. Um, so we have to be very careful with that threshold um, because of things like inbreeding, right? We talk about that a little bit during genetics, that if we're constantly mating individuals who are closely related to each other, their genetics are so close to each other as well that you end up with some of those recessive disorders that become more prevalent, even though we know from an evolutionary standpoint they should get weeded out over time because they are harmful. You don't have enough genetic diversity, and now that those recessive diseases show up much more frequently, which continues to have implications then to being able to maintain a healthy population size. So all of these levels of diversity are things that we have to concern ourselves with in terms of conservation, because they are all just as important to ensuring that the global biodiversity is capable of being maintained. So, what are some of the biggest threats to the biodiversity of an ecosystem or the biodiversity of the globe as a whole? One of the big ones is habitat fragmentation. So, the more we fragment habitats for living organisms by building roads between them, by putting up developments, by just cutting up the land into parcels, we are preventing organisms from accessing what we talk about as their entire home range. What is it? Their entire potential location or habitat to live in. And this is most obvious, I think, with bigger organisms. Think about how many of us have seen a white-tailed deer hit on the side of the road or have potentially hit one, whether it was you personally or somebody you were in the car with. We have very much fragmented their habitats. So, what do they end up doing? Well, they've got to get from one place to the next, and so they end up walking across our roads. Um, and so, not only does that become dangerous to us as motorists, but it does end up causing issues for their population sizes. And that's just one example. You go out west, and there's a lot of bear and wolves and all these sorts of organisms that have huge need for big chunks of land for them to be able to survive and reproduce and have all the resources that they need. And if we cut highways through them or we build large cities in the middle of them, not only is that going to have implications for problems for us, but it's certainly going to drive down the diversity in their own populations. Invasive species, also a big threat to biodiversity. So when we talk about invasive species, probably one of the first things that comes to mind are those lovely little stink bugs, or the lanternflies that we are now dealing with. And these are species that are brought into an ecosystem by humans. And sometimes it's completely by accident. And in other cases, it's done on purpose in an effort to do something, and we didn't really uh, anticipate the population growth that they experienced, or just the impacts that they ended up having. It's something we have to be very careful about if we're purposefully bringing in a species for some reason. So, what ends up happening with these invasive species is that they are not native to the area that they are brought into, and as a result, they lack native predators. There may be minimal, if any, parasites or diseases that kind of keep their general population size in check. So we bring them into an ecosystem with which a niche exists that they can fill. So a niche that is similar to their native location. But in the absence of those predators and those parasites and that disease, they quickly end up going through exponential growth because there's nothing keeping their population size in check, but there is the right set of circumstances, um, climate, food sources, that allow them to be able to reproduce. And oftentimes they'll outpace and outcompete the species that is maybe similar to them in that environment, but that native species does have those predators, does have that disease, and has been keeping their population size in check for as long as they've existed. We bring in that invasive species and they just explode and take over, and can often end up causing the decline of the native equivalent to potentially the levels of extinction. Um, so those stink bugs definitely have some problems for us in terms of just being annoying, but they also go after our crops. And because there isn't as much here to eat them, their population size just exploded. They actually came into Allentown, um, by a shipping crate, right? This little guy happened to crawl into it. They're native to places like China and South Asia, and they happen to crawl into a shipping container. We move that shipping container across the ocean. They happen to survive long enough to make it here, and our climate is very similar, and so they're going after things like our soybean crops, and having wreaking some pretty big havoc there. So we're trying to figure out how to control them. Stink bugs, or excuse me, the lanternflies are a similar idea. Came in over a shipping container, also from South Asia, which has very similar climates to us, and they are very much wreaking havoc on a lot of our tree populations. And so we're doing a lot of research trying to figure out how to manage them, how to mitigate their effects, and fingers crossed that some of the natural predators that exist here for some of their equivalents start going after them too. But those predators need to learn that this is something that they can eat and they can use as a food source, and that's not something that happens overnight. Overharvesting, also a big problem, a big threat to biodiversity. So taking out large organisms that have low reproductive rates, those are particularly vulnerable because if we are going after them as a food source or for some other product that we want out of them, furs, whatever the case might be, those organisms are so big, and so they only have one or two young and at a time, and they don't have a super um, high replenish rate, if you will. They don't reproduce fast enough to outpace the demand for them. And so we're taking them out of the environment quicker than their population size is able to maintain its size. And so then you end up in the problem of sort of that extinction vortex, and genetic diversity drops off, and you get a lot of inbreeding. So disease becomes a problem as far as genetic diseases are concerned. And then just global change as a whole, the pollution, the acid rain, the global increases in temperatures, all of this is having impacts on the survival of not only uh, plants, but animals. The ecosystems are getting adjusted more rapidly than the organisms are capable of adapting from natural selection. And so that biodiversity continues to decrease as organisms go extinct or at least leave certain ecosystems because of those particular sets of conditions that are rapidly changing on them. And that's assuming, of course, that they are capable of getting up and leaving. Plants and things like that are not going to be able to do that. And so you'll get local extinction. But if this continues to spread, we can talk about global extinction of organisms as well.